Okay, good evening, everyone. We're going to use this screencast video to work through your first module in your text, um, uh, basically working through historical figures, psychological movements, basic history and systems types of things. Idea here is to give you a sense for the development of psychology as a branch of science. Psychology, or the study of psychology, is relatively new. Psychology is a formal area of study, has been around along about the same amount of time as we've had electric lighting or professional baseball. So in the grand scheme of areas of study, still relatively young. And where we are now as a field is in many ways very different from where we started. And so as we walk through some of this material, you'll know that each of the movements that we talk about are going to develop in response to a previous movement. So psychology is an area of study not all that different than music, fashion, things along those lines, right? We have a group of people who hit on something, they think it's interesting and cool, and we're going to do this for a while, but then after a while you get another group of people who start to rebel against that and say, no, no, no. This is off base. We need to be doing something different. And so as you're going and trying to make sense of this, use that as a device to recognize and keep some of these movements straight. Okay, that's kind of the theme that will tie some of this together. Also for your psychology majors, you'll notice that the names, ideas that we're going to run through in this lecture are going to keep popping up again and again as you run through later classes. So good basic foundation before we get started into some of the stuff later down the semester. So, big question, what is psychology? Okay, defining psychology, psychological science, is a little bit different. And what psychology has meant historically and the types of things that we study has started to change throughout, or has often changed as psychology as a science has progressed over the years. Things like what topics are relevant, what methods do we use to understand human behavior and study human behavior, what types of things do psychologists do. All of these have changed and shifted to the point that, where we are right now. So at the very broad level, psychology as a science, we can define this as the study of the mind and behavior. Okay, and as we go through and look at some of these different movements, and as we progress through class, you'll notice that we focus on biological mechanisms, psychological or mental, emotional types of factors, sociocultural factors. All of these fall under the broad umbrella of psychological science. And as we think about where we are and what we know about human behavior, and cognition today, been shaped by a number of movements, historical figures that we can identify during different points in time. So before we have psychology, before psychology organized as its own field, we had philosophy. Okay, before we were talking about psychology as a field of study, we had philosophers who were the people who were writing on things like consciousness, the basic characteristics of human nature, what the mind was, and how we think about thought and logic and things along those lines, right? So we have Aristotle talking about the basis of intellect. We have Descartes talking about how the mind, the physical mind, or the physical body interacts with the mind. John Locke is talking about how we acquire knowledge. Before we had psychology as a formal science, these were the people who were starting to talk about things that would eventually become what we know as science today. Now, for any of you philosophy majors or any of you who've taken philosophy classes, you know that a lot of this is just logic and reasoning and thinking about sort of the nature of some of these things. When we get into psychological science, we start to be more systematic. And when we think about the birth of psychology, where psychology really got its start as a field, is we can identify a movement known as structuralism. Okay, now to give you some context, in Germany, in the late 19th century. Okay, so we're talking about the late 1800s. Germany's a scientific powerhouse. German universities are up and coming. They're not up and coming, but established centers starting to expand on what we might think about hard sciences, expanding our natural sciences, things like biology, chemistry, things like that, to start to look into systematic study of history, archaeology, literature, things along those lines, right? And so this is the context in which the study of behavior and the mind really took its root, okay? And when we look at structuralism, primary objective of structuralism was this idea to determine the structure of the mind. Okay, you can see that kind of in the name of the movement, structuralism. The idea was, right, so we've got things like biology and chemistry, where we're breaking things down into their basic, very fundamental components. Okay, a gentleman named William Wundt, the first person to say, hey, what we want to do is we want to look and determine the basic function and basic structure of the mind. Okay, and what they're trying to do is basically think about this as we want to have a periodic table of elements of the mind. We want to break mental processes down to their very basic building blocks, like we have with chemistry, like we have with biology. And with this, we can go through and start to examine things like attention, sensation, perception. Okay, so very structured. And so in differentiating psychology as a field from philosophy, structuralists identified things like the soul or higher powers, things like that, inappropriate for psychology, right? Only things that we can sort of see and test and things along those lines. Okay, so again, psychology originally sort of was a movement trying to use the principles of hard sciences to start thinking about human behavior in the mind. Okay, and so in Germany at this time, this setting provided William Wundt an opportunity to start a systematic investigation of the consciousness. Okay, and again, he's looking at, in his words, atoms of the mind, right? The basic building blocks. Now, Wundt identified generally as the father of psychology, not because of his ideas necessarily, but it was the scientific approach that he took to the study of mental processes. So, unlike philosophy, where we sort of think about some ideas about how things probably fit together, here we're actually moving into the systematic testing and using scientific method to go through and try and make inferences about behavior. And Wundt was one of the first people to develop psychology as its own independent science. Okay, so major figures here: William Wundt authored the first psychology textbook, Principles of Psychology. His graduate student, Edward Titchener, sort of taking this structuralism movement further, identifying three primary elements of the mind. Again, thinking about the basic structure, the basic components of the mind. In Titchener's opinion, the mind was made up of sensations, which are obviously physical sensations, images, which are going to be thoughts, and affections, which are going to be emotions, right? So you can see how these gentlemen were approaching the idea of thought, consciousness, by saying these are the basic building blocks, right? And that's the fundamental approach to structuralism, okay? So, great movement. And the first group of individuals who were trying to formulate psychology as a recognized field of study. And one of the primary tools that the structuralists used was an approach called introspection. Okay, now the idea behind introspection is if I'm going to study things like sensation and perception, right, and how you experience certain things, an assumption of introspection is that the only person who can observe these sensations and these processes, these conscious processes, are the individual experiencing it, right? As I stand in front of you all in any given lecture and look out at you, I can't think your thoughts. I can't feel your feelings. Only you can think your thoughts and feel your feelings. And from an early structuralist perspective, the idea was if we're going to learn about how people experience certain things or how people develop thoughts or reactions and things along those lines, what we need to do is we need to get people, graduate students, people who have made it very far in education, and we need to teach them to be able to go through and reflect or introspect on their own experiences and report those experiences. And with that, we're going to start drawing conclusions about consciousness. Okay, and so what this method might look like is I might go through and I might have someone experience some type of stimuli over and over and over and over again under different types of conditions. Okay, and so what I might do is I might have some sort of audio or some sort of noise like that. Okay, I snapped in the mic. Hopefully that went through. And what I want you to do is, if you're a student, I'm going to snap, and I'm going to have you hit a bell as soon as you perceive that snap, right? And we would do that over and over and over again. And so every time you hear that, you hit a bell as fast as you can, and we measure that reaction time. And we might do that 100 times. And we might do that when you're tired or when you're hungry or when you're alert or after you've drank caffeine, and do that over and over and over again to try and get a sense for and learn something about how you experience it, how quickly you can react. Okay? But then what I might do, after we get a bunch of trials there, I might say, okay, I'm going to do the same thing. And this time, I want you to hit a bell as soon as you're aware that you've perceived that snap. Okay? And this is a little bit different. This is adding another step in the process. I'm not just reacting automatically when I hear the snap. I'm hitting a bell when I perceive myself perceiving that snap. Okay? And so these were the types of things. Like, no one else can go through and respond to your experience except the person who's doing it. And so we're talking about, in the late 18th century, German graduate students being trained to do this over and over and over and over again, and trying to learn through introspection about the mind. Okay? Another example. So what I might do if I was doing a study using introspection is I might show you a screen like this, right? And I might say, describe this stimuli without using any words or any color words. And so what I would want you to do is describe your experience of this color that I'm presenting to you without using color words, right? And we might do this a number of times with different studies and different lighting, things along those lines, to try and get a sense for how people experience color. Okay? And so a nice approach to trying to go through and develop some ideas on basic building blocks of the mind, but criticisms of structuralism, right? Problem in that there's no real way, if I have one person who experiences this color as green and another who experiences this as blue, we're left with just your own experiences of that color. There's no way to reconcile those differences, right? So there's no way to say who's right, who's wrong. There's really no objective criteria for a lot of the things that we're doing with introspection, and so that's kind of difficult. Other problem is that people are often poor behaviors of their own, or poor observers of their own experience. As we'll talk about down the road, if you do something and I ask you why you did it, the reasons you give me may be very different than what we might draw from an actual study. Okay, and so while structuralism was a good first start, some criticisms, some limitations of this early movement. So, about the time that structuralism was getting started, we had an American movement in psychology known as functionalism. And what the functionalists said, functionalism came out as a reaction to Wundt and the things that folks were doing in Germany, and said, hey, you know what? This whole idea of trying to look at and identify the basic building blocks, the basic fundamental components of the mind, That's nonsense. That's not what we should be wasting our time, or what we should be spending our time doing. What we need to be doing is looking at the function of psychological processes. Okay, who cares what they're made of? What are they doing? What's the purpose of different types of behaviors that we see? The core question with functionalism is, what do these mental processes accomplish, and how do these types of things help organisms adapt to the environment? How do they help people stay alive? Okay. Now, if you're paying attention, you might notice that there's a strong kind of functional survival piece to this. And William James, the founder of functionalism, heavily influenced by the work of Charles Darwin. Okay. The idea being, I don't care what the basic components of the mind or consciousness are. I want to know how consciousness, how mental processes, how behaviors keep human animals alive, right? So if I go through and I notice that babies cry, okay? Babies crying, if anybody's had, and probably everybody in class has heard babies crying, dealt with babies crying, it can be an aversive experience, right? It's not something that we can easily ignore. It's kind of an aversive stimulus, right? And so what's the purpose of this? Why do babies cry? Well, it's hard to ignore crying babies. And if baby's crying, we're almost driven to go through and try and quiet that baby, try and soothe that baby, right? So we can think about babies crying from a functionalist standpoint as being incredibly adaptive, right? This is something that children do in order to receive care from adults, caregivers, because they're not able to provide it for themselves. If babies didn't cry, we might leave them and forget about them, and then bad things would happen because they need constant attention, right? And so, again, the purpose of functionalism, the main question in functionalism is we don't care how consciousness is made up. We're more interested in what it does, okay? Other thing, too, that functionalists emphasized was this idea of context, right? So we've got structuralists in labs in Germany listening to multiple snaps and hitting bells in response to things, or looking at colors and describing what that color looks like to how they experience that without using color words. Functionalists said this is nonsense. Okay, from a functionalist standpoint, everything depends on context, right? Our environment's always changing. Our consciousness is always changing based on things that are going on around us. And if I am only looking at things in a sterile lab, I'm missing the whole point of why we experience colors, or why we're able to react to sounds, things along those lines. So a very different approach in terms of its aims than the initial movement of structuralism. Okay, so William James, the father of functionalism, a lot of great stuff. Impacting context in psychological processes, working with the assumption that consciousness is something that we've developed to enhance survival, influential textbook, and again, heavily influenced by the work of Charles Darwin. Now, from a functionalist standpoint, primary tool was something that James labeled the comparative method. Okay. Now, again, remember, to this point, structuralists are working in sterile laboratories, and the only people who are involved in research, the only participants, are highly trained graduate students, academics. Again, functionalists said this is nonsense. You're all going off in the wrong direction. What functionalists did was took research out of the lab and out into the field. Okay, and the idea was to look at different populations to start to determine what function psychological processes serve. Okay, and so instead of just looking at graduate students and having graduate students tell us how they experience certain types of things, what we're doing is we're going out in the field and starting to look at children. People who have mental disabilities, psychiatric patients, animals, just going through and observing how different populations interact, how they behave, and starting to use that as a way to go through and start to infer certain things about the function of different types of behaviors. Another controversial step at the time was the introduction of self-report assessments. All right. If I want to know why you did something, I'm just going to hand you a questionnaire and say, why did you do that thing? Give you your attitudes, opinions, things along those. And we're not restricting this to just academics and highly trained graduate students. We're just asking Joe Blow on the street to go through and report on different types of behaviors, things along those lines, right? Looking at people who don't have major mental illness and comparing them to people who do have major mental illness, trying to understand dysfunctions there. Observing animals, right? Functionalists were the first to say, hey, maybe we can learn something about human behavior by observing bonding behavior in animals, right? So again, very radical departure from early structuralism. Okay. Now the criticisms of functionalism. Primary emphasis on the practical application of psychological processes. Okay, so functionalism, as indicated in the name, very interested in the function of behavior, right? And so we versus structuralism, where it's the basic building blocks. What are the basic components? And this dichotomy exists today in what we would call basic versus applied science. Basic science is science for the sake of doing science. Science understanding to know specific processes, things along those lines. Applied science, this is stuff that's going to go through and look at how we can use certain types of findings to improve lives, to change behavior, things along those lines. So if I'm looking at how mitochondria in a cell split, that's going to be basic science. If I'm looking to see if this biological intervention changes how mitochondria work in a cell to impact some disease, that's an applied approach. Okay, so again, functionalism, very applied research. Structuralism, you can think about that as more basic. Okay, underlying principles of functionalism also controversial in some spheres from a social perspective. Again, heavily influenced by Charles Darwin. This idea that behaviors have developed or evolved over time to help ensure survival. Again, this is something that can be controversial within elements of science or elements of society, and something that is a basic premise that can be problematic in some circles. Okay. So we've got functionalism doing its thing. Okay, about the same time functionalism is going on, we have psychoanalysis emerging in Europe based on the work of Sigmund Freud. I imagine everybody in the class has heard about Sigmund Freud. Freud was a medical doctor, had a private practice in clinical neurology, right? So this is like a brain doctor, but he's a medical doctor. Okay, and so Freud started to put together ideas, theories about personality, what makes people tick, but recognizing that Freud lived in Victorian Austria in the late 19th century, early 20th century. Okay, and Freud's ideas about what made people tick very, very strongly influenced by Victorian culture. Okay, so if anybody in class knows anything about Victorian culture, one of the things it's kind of known for is this very, very rigid adherence to social rules, regulations, things along those lines. General preoccupation with sexuality too, right? This is a culture where we cover the legs of tables with tablecloths so that no one gets sexual thoughts about seeing a table leg, right? We talk about things in terms of white meat and dark meat instead of breasts and thighs about chicken, so that we aren't tempted with or have dirty thoughts if we're talking about turkey meat and things along those lines. Pretty rigid, high collars, long sleeves buttoned up. And so these are the types of things, and we'll talk about this as we get into some Freud stuff later on, that really starts to influence Freud's ideas about what make people work. Okay, so primary objective of psychoanalysis is 1, provide a model of personality development, 2, to provide a philosophy of human nature, and 3, serves as a basis for a new form of psychotherapy. Okay, now Again, we'll get into the ins and outs of psychoanalysis later on this semester, but for right now, recognizing that from a Freudian perspective, from a psychoanalytic perspective, looking at behavior as deterministic and influenced by unconscious drives, right? And if we say something is deterministic, we mean that even though you think you have control over your behavior, right? In your mind, you've sat down to watch this video because you've chosen to do so. Freud would say, nope, right? Your decision, your behavior to sit down and watch this video is driven by things outside of your awareness, highly influenced by two unconscious drives. Life instincts, this is the drive for pleasure, growth, and achievement. These are the things that make us want to go through, strive, succeed. This innate drive for growth, things that feel good, achievement, things that we like, offset by death instincts. This is the aggressive drive to hurt yourself, other people. This is our self-destructive drive. This is our desire, our unconscious desire to wreak chaos on ourselves and everybody around us. Okay? And so, again, from Freud's perspective, we understand human behavior based on these two competing instincts. Okay, so you think that you go about and walk through life because you choose and make active decisions. Psychoanalysis would say, nope, this is all determined by unconscious forces that are operating outside of your awareness. Okay, so primary mode of study for psychoanalytic perspective when Freud's developing some of these ideas. Primarily basing his understanding of human nature based on psychotherapy cases that he's seeing in his office, right? This is classic, you see in the movies, like lay down on a couch and just talk about whatever goes in your mind, right? And so Freud's going down, taking case notes, making observations, and based on people coming in with different anxieties, psychological difficulties, developing a theory of personality and human behavior based on his observations in a clinical setting. Okay. Now, criticisms of this, there are a lot. Okay. We'll again talk about pros and cons of some of Freud's ideas later on, but from a perspective of psychological science, some issues. One, people who are struggling to the point that they're coming in to seek active treatment might not be representative of typical human behavior, right? So you could make an argument to say, well, it's not really fair to build an entire theory of human behavior and personality and human nature based on people who are actively experiencing difficult things in their lives, right? So we might say that his sample was biased. Okay. Other problem, from a scientific standpoint, Freud is using uncontrolled methods to develop his theory. Okay. Very poor records, right? Random notes and things along those lines. This isn't a systematic study as we would see with structuralism as functionalism. This is just Freud kind of doing his thing, writing down notes and really kind of developing sort of his thoughts about human nature based on case studies, uncontrolled methods in developing his ideas. And then finally, confirmation bias. Okay, confirmation bias is endemic in human behavior. We're all vulnerable to this at all times. Confirmation bias involves selectively attending to information that confirms things that we already think we know or we believe, right? So if I'm Freud and I think by nature that people are inherently bad, okay? People are inherently driven towards pleasure and their own self-interest, things along those lines. As I'm talking with people, I'm probably going to key in on things that would be consistent with that and systematically exclude, not maybe intentionally, but evidence that suggests that people can be altruistic, people can be caring, giving, things along those lines. Okay? Politics is a good example of confirmation bias, right? If I have a certain perspective on something, and I'm likely to go out and seek out information that basically confirms what I want to hear, right? We do this all the time. If I think Bob is a bad friend, I'm probably going to selectively attend to evidence that in my mind confirms the fact that Bob's a bad friend. And even if Bob's going out and doing things that are helpful and altruistic, I'm probably going to ignore that or weight the stuff that I think means he's a jerk much more heavily, right? And so this is what happens when we've got one person doing case studies, building a theory on their own notes and stuff like that, have a strong opportunity for confirmation bias with this. Yeah. So we've got psychoanalysis kicking along, right? Psychoanalysis gaining traction in Europe, and about the time psychoanalysis is getting going, we have a movement in American psychology called behaviorism. Okay, and behaviorism goes on to emerge as one of the most influential movements in modern psychology. Okay, behaviorists are coming in. Behaviorists are saying, so these constructs, these things like life instincts, death instincts, unconscious, imagination, these are useless. Okay, and they're useless because I can't see them. I can't see your unconscious. I can't see your imagination. I can't see you thinking, right? What I can see is I can see you behaving. I can see you doing things in the environment because I can observe it directly. And from a behaviorist standpoint, the idea is if I can't observe it directly and it doesn't involve some form of learning, it's not worth looking or thinking or talking about. Okay, so the primary objective of behaviorism is to determine the rules that govern observable behavior. Okay, and we're saying that psychological study, we're going to limit psychology to acts and the study of things that can be directly observed and seen, right? So if we're talking about sensation, imagination, consciousness, this is useless. And from a behaviorist standpoint, from a strict behaviorist standpoint, I'm saying that all behavior can be understood as a function of this stimulus-response reaction. Okay, so think about a basic learning paradigm, right? If you hit a lever and a food pellet comes out, you're going to keep hitting that lever because you've been rewarded for it. Okay. On the other hand, if you scratch your nose and you get shocked, and every time you scratch your nose you get shocked, you're probably going to stop scratching your nose, right? And so from a behaviorist standpoint, we're understanding how people exist in the world, and we're understanding people's behavior as a function of things that they've been rewarded for or things that they've been punished for, right? So it's all stimulus response reactions learning. So even though, and so Freud's approach, at the end of the day, Freud was using uncontrolled methods, few session notes, no systematic study. Freud's stuff was much more similar to a philosophy than a psychological science. Behaviorism going in the complete opposite direction and saying if I can't see it, feel it, touch, taste it, it's not worth studying. Okay, but similar to psychoanalysis, right? Behaviorist is still saying that your behavior is deterministic, right? You aren't going to come to class on Friday because you choose to come to class. You come to class because in the past you've been reinforced for coming to class. When you come to class, you do better, and you get praise from professors, and you get praise from parents and teachers, and that then increases the likelihood of you coming to class again. When you don't come to class, you get yelled at, you fail exams, you get a punishing response, which decreases the likelihood of you skipping in the future, right? So even though you think you're coming to class because you want to or because you have decided to, behaviorists, a strict radical behaviorist would say, no, you didn't. You came to class because of based on a reinforcement or punishment in the past. Okay, so very different, very rigid, structured approach, but similar in terms of this deterministic view of human behavior. Okay, so major people in this field: B.F. Skinner. We'll talk about him down the road, and he's a primary figure in operant conditioning. Don't have to worry about what operant conditioning is right now, just as an FYI. Also John Watson, another major figure looking at classical conditioning. Operant conditioning is a mouse hitting a lever and being rewarded for food pellets. Okay, contingent responding. Classical conditioning is pairing reflexive reactions. Think Pavlov's dogs. That's John Watson. That's classical conditioning stuff. Again, don't need to worry about names, or excuse me, probably need to know names, but dates and some of this stuff. Just getting a general idea for the basic issues of behaviorism here. Okay, so behaviorism as a movement. Okay, dominant orientation in psychology for 50 years. Okay, huge advancements in making psychology a more structured and objective field of study. Also some major contributions to behavior modification. If you come to me for treatment for some sort of anxiety, say you have a phobia, we're going to use basic principles of behaviorism to help break some of those stimulus response reactions that we know underscore a lot of different anxiety related responses. So huge advancements as a consequence of behaviorism. Criticisms, though, of radical behaviorism. Now, behaviorism today is very different than behaviorism as it initially got started in the mid-19th century. Okay, but that original and very intense, strict form of behaviorism, sometimes called radical behaviorism, been criticized for rejecting freedom of choice and free will. Right? Again, this is a deterministic approach, saying that you're not choosing to do things. All of your behavior is a function of stimulus response things. Okay. Also, radical behaviorism, refusal to acknowledge influence of internal processes, right? You're not reacting to things because you're thinking about things, and you're not reacting to things because you're feeling about things. It's all your interaction with external environment. I can't see your thoughts and your feelings, so it's not worth studying from a very strict radical behaviorism standpoint, and people start to have problems with this because it's a little bit stringent, or a lot stringent. Also, the reduction of human functioning to observable behaviors. Many would argue that there's a lot more to being a human than just what we can see and observe and what you think and do. Okay? All right, so that's behaviorism. Which brings us to humanistic psychology. Okay? Psychoanalysis, behaviorism, dominant orientations through the beginning of the 20th century. Okay, but sort of around late 70s, humanistic movement starts to gain traction. We've got psychoanalysis, which is focusing only on psychopathology and dysfunction. Again, this is an entire theory of human behavior that's based on Freud's work with psychological people coming in for psychological services, right? And so psychoanalysis mostly focused on pathology, dysfunction. Behaviorism, you've got sort of this rigid approach that's can be perceived as cold and not capturing human experience and potential. Both of these orientations, as I said, highly deterministic, downplay free will. Free will is not a thing that's going into this. It's either unconscious drives or learning history. Humanistic psychology comes forward and says this is nonsense. What we should be thinking about and what we need to be considering, what we're missing, is influences on human strengths, aspirations, potential, achievement, all the things that make people amazing. What are the things that go through and make people excel and be the best people that they can be? What makes people go through and achieve? All of this is negative and sterile. What we want to do is we want to understand the human experience and what makes people amazing. Okay, a couple of major figures here: Abraham Maslow, Carl Rogers. We'll talk about these guys a little bit farther, but these are two people highly influential in this humanistic field. And humanistic psychology aspired to replace both psychoanalysis and behaviorism. Now, unfortunately, or depending on how you look at it, humanistic perspective didn't end up as emerging as a strong influence. Psychoanalysis, radical behaviorism, starting to be on the decline once humanistic psychologists were starting to have kind of their heyday. But in terms of psychological science, less of an influence of humanistic psychology than they would have liked, but a lasting influence on things like psychotherapeutic practice. Okay, if you come in, right, and you're going to get services, hopefully people are going to be focusing, at least to some extent, on strengths, things that make you resilient, things along those lines, things like unconditional positive regard, empathy, things along these lines are going to be a strong component and contributions of humanistic psychology to therapeutic practice, right? But in terms of understanding human behavior more broadly, humanistic psychology has been criticized by building entire theories based on small samples of really amazing people, right? So if we think about Maslow, and we'll talk about him, Maslow has this idea of self-actualization, right? And so what Maslow did is observed or took biographies of people like, let's say, George Washington, Albert Einstein, Mother Teresa, and Gandhi, like these very incredibly exceptional people, and started to build an idea of what it took for people to self-actualize based on a very small selection of people. And so that starts to become problematic. Person-centered therapy, which we'll talk about later, largely based on undergraduate clients. Now, all of you are exceptional individuals just by the very fact that you've made it to university and are studying, right? Now, the things that impact you and your behavior as young adults in an institute of higher learning may be very difficult than other populations at different points in their lives. And so sometimes unconditional positive regard isn't going to be enough. It's important, but maybe not enough to help all people get to where they need to be. And again, this idea of just being in a supportive therapeutic environment where I'm just taking a non-judgmental and empathetic standpoint, maybe that's going to be helpful for everyone, but it might not be enough to fully address some of the pervasive mental health issues that start to come up in clinical settings. And so again, some amazing things coming out of humanistic psychology, but limitations and criticisms there. All right, so the last movement we're going to talk about is cognitive psychology. By about the 1970s, there were some people who were trained in the behaviorist perspective that are starting to break rank, and they're starting to say, hey, you know what? So we're training in this field that's saying we're not going to look at people's thoughts because we can't observe people's thoughts. But I'm a human existing in the universe, and it's very clear that I'm having thoughts in my brain. It's kind of maybe problematic that we're just discounting this and not even pulling this into our understanding of human behavior. And the idea behind cognitive psychology was maybe what we can do is we can say that cognition or thinking is a form of observable behavior. Okay? So if I'm having a thought about my performance on this screencast, we might think about that as a type of behavior. Now, it's a behavior that's going on in my head, and you can't see it, but it's something that's going on, and maybe what we can do is maybe we can use observable behaviors to start to draw conclusions about things that are going on in my head. So again, I might want to start to think about things like perception, attention, and sensation by building experiments where I can start to watch you behave and start to make some inferences about how people perceive things, how people attend to things, how people feel things, right? And again, what's interesting is that this starts to link back into some of the original stuff that Wundt was doing. Some of these topics like attention, sensation, perception, these are things that the structuralists very early on in the very beginning were interested in. We've kind of come full circle with cognitive psychology. Cognitive psychologists are interested in some of these things, but they're using some different methods to go through and test, right? So how fast can you react to a stimulus? What types of factors impact how long you can attend to a certain type of task, right? What does your performance on certain types of memory tasks tell us about how the brain stores information, right? So interested in some of the same things that structuralists were interested in, but using some different types of methods. Another big issue that came in and was a big influence on cognitive psychology was emerging computer technology in the 70s. Okay, this really started to build on this idea of the brain as a computer, building this metaphor of computer technology as maybe we can think about our brains as processing information similar to these machines that we've set up to go through, and thinking about your brain as a computer for problem solving, reasoning, things along those lines. Okay, so cognitive psychology, cognitive, just a fancy word for thinking. These are people who have broke free of behaviorism and said, hey, we want to stop ignoring the brain and thoughts, and we want to start working and thinking about how this is the influence we're having here. Yeah. Criticisms of cognitive psychology. Sometimes people will criticize the methods, procedures as lacking ecological validity. Okay, ecological validity means is this thing that we've demonstrated within the context of a laboratory, does this have any relation to stuff that's going on out in the universe, right? So I can bring you in to the lab and I can demonstrate some effect within the confines of my sterile lab, but does that have anything to do with how people behave out in the universe, right? Because the universe is not a sterile lab. The universe is interactions with other people. There's a lot of different things going on. So even if I can establish some finding within the context of my laboratory, if I can't demonstrate that out in the real world, I might criticize that as lacking ecological validity. We also call this external validity. And again, some of the same criticisms we had about Wundt in terms of this basic versus applied science. Okay, so that takes us through the major psychological movements, historical movements. It kind of brings us up to speed. We'll spend the rest of the semester talking about sort of some more research in some of these different fields. But the last thing we want to talk about before we finish up is this idea of research ethics. Now, a lot of the studies that we will talk about are classic in the psychology literature, in the psychological canon, right? But you'll notice as we talk about these studies, a lot of them seem pretty messed up, quite frankly. We're doing, or not we, wasn't a part of it, but psychologists as a field were doing things that are maybe questionable from a perspective of ethics. Can we just do things to people and not worry about the consequences? Now, a couple of things in the 19th century, and sort of formal ethics didn't get started in terms of regulating psychological science until the late 70s. But there were a couple things that happened in the 20th century that really got people starting to think, oh, we need to think about regulating science and research in general. One, World War II, Nazi Germany. You had Nazi scientists conducting horrible biological experiments on people without their consent, against their will. The atrocities of World War II shocked the world to think that people could be doing this stuff. But technically, there wasn't anything that said you couldn't do that outside of just basic human decency, right? So Nazi Germany started to get people thinking about, hey, we need to have some sort of ethics. But also, here in America, we had a study known as the Tuskegee Syphilis Study. Okay, this was conducted from 1932 to 1972. And what this Tuskegee study was doing is they were interested, medical researchers interested in the impact of syphilis, right? So syphilis has been around forever, right? We know syphilis is bad, syphilis is no good. But what these researchers wanted to do was track the progression of syphilis just to see what it did and systematically study it, right? And so what they did is they had 600 rural African-American sharecroppers in Alabama, right? So these are individuals with limited resources, right? What we'd identify as a vulnerable population. And about 2/3 of these individuals had syphilis. And so what researchers did is they recruited them into this into this study, right? And then they just followed them, okay? For between 1932 and 1972, just watched these people to see what happened as syphilis progressed through their bodies, right? participants were never told they had the disease. And about halfway through, when penicillin became available and was able to treat the syphilis, researchers actively prevented participants from getting treatment because if they would have gotten treated for their syphilis, they wouldn't be able to watch the progression of syphilis, right? And so if you know anything about syphilis, the symptoms of advanced syphilis are bad. And what we had is a group of experimenters just watching people slowly die and deteriorate just to see what would happen so that they could document this. And not only just watching it happen, not offering treatment when treatment was available, actively preventing these men from going in and getting treated. Okay? Now, when this hit the news, this was huge. People were shocked that this could happen. But again, there were no ethics to regulate this. And so in 1978, we get the Belmont Report. Belmont Report summarizes our basic ethical principles for behavioral research, biomedical research, and it's really shocking that it took until 78. Like, research ethics, as terms of a formal sort of regulations, haven't been around nearly as long as they should. But by the late 70s, have the Belmont Report. Now, research ethics is an incredibly fascinating topic. Really complicated, but for our purpose, we're going to focus on 3 basic ethical principles. First principle is respect for persons. Okay, respect for persons involves the belief that 1, individuals or participants should be treated as autonomous agents, and that 2, individuals with diminished autonomy are entitled to additional protections. And so if we say people are autonomous, we're saying that you, as an autonomous individual, are free to make decisions based on informed choices. So if I lay out all the benefits and risks of a study, and you decide to participate, then that's your decision to make. But what I can't do as a researcher is I can't hide risks from you. Right? I can't say, oh no, it's going to be fine, when I know it's not going to be fine, because then I'm depriving you of the opportunity to make an informed choice, right? And so one of the primary research procedures that have come out of this respect for person is this idea of informed consent. As you participate in research studies, you will always provide some sort of informed consent to participate in a study, where we're laying out basic procedures, what you can expect, time commitments, risks, benefits, and then based on that, you can decide whether or not this is something you want to participate in or something that you don't want to. Okay. Other thing that comes on in respect for person, we do have in our world individuals with some level of diminished autonomy. Okay. We talk about these as vulnerable populations. These are going to be children, right? Children can't make informed decisions on their own because they're too young to appreciate potential risks, things along those lines. People like prisoners, right? If I'm in a penal institution, I don't get a chance to say what I do or don't want to do. I'm often told what I will or won't do, and so that reduces autonomy. People with intellectual disabilities, people who are economically disadvantaged. I can't develop a new treatment for some illness that's incredibly dangerous, right? This might make you better, or it could kill you. It's kind of a 50-50 flip, right? And so what I want to do is anybody who has means is probably not going to do this. But if I go into an impoverished neighborhood and offer people $10,000 to participate in my study, they're going to do it, right? Even though the risks are immense, this is a vulnerable population because you don't get a chance to 100% decide whether you do or don't want to do it because I'm offering you $10,000 and that might be more than you make over the course of several years, right? Also active military. Again, if you have a commanding officer that tells you to do something, you get to do it, or that you have to do it. And again, so any research that we would do with the military, again, identifying that as a vulnerable population. So this respect for persons, leading in this idea of informed consent, this idea that we can have people participate in our studies, but we need to let them know what they should expect. Okay. Beneficence is our second ethical principle. Beneficence involves the obligation to 1, do no harm, and 2, maximize possible benefits and minimize possible harms. Okay, if we think about the Tuskegee study, this is an issue of beneficence here. Okay, this was a study that actively caused harm and did not take efforts to maximize the benefits. Now, studying syphilis is not unethical, but the way the Tuskegee researchers studied syphilis was unethical. One, we're actively causing harm to people, and there are ways to go through and study the impact of syphilis without letting people continue on and watch as they slowly waste away because they have a disease that we know how to fix and cure and treat. Okay, same thing. So I do research with anxiety and trauma and post-traumatic stress disorder. If I want to study that, there are ways to do that, right? But if I say, for my study, I'm proposing to bring you in, I'm going to put you in a car and crash you in a wall so that you get all busted up, and then I'm just going to wait and see what happens, that's one, I'm causing active harm, and 2, I'm not maximizing benefits, minimizing possible harms with that, right? Sometimes research is risky, but if we have risky research, we need to put in place measures to assure that you can do this as safely as possible, and then 2, with our respect for persons, with that informed consent, letting you know what those risks are and allowing you to make a decision to participate or not. Last ethical principle we'll talk about here is a principle of justice. Okay, justice involves our efforts to equally distribute both benefit and burden of research. Okay, a lot of times this boils down to fair and equitable treatment within a population. So if I have an amazing study, or an amazing treatment for cancer, right? My decisions on who gets involved, who gets the treatment, when gets the treatment, these are all factors related to justice, right? I can't say, well, what I'm going to do is I'm going to put all the men in the treatment group and all the women in the control group, because then I have an unjust research design, right? Men are getting all the benefit, women are not. They're serving as controls, and so they're not gaining the benefit of that, right? Or what I'm going to do is I'm going to run these drug trials only in affluent college students so that they benefit. Or I'm going to test this risky treatment in this population and then only treat this other population once I've got all the kinks worked out, right? So these are issues of justice, making sure that we have fair and balanced both burden and benefit of research across individuals. Okay, so research ethics involves a lot more than this, but these are the 3 basic principles that we're always striving for in terms of designing our different studies. All right, folks. That was a little bit long, but we got through this whole thing. At the end of each one of these lectures, you'll see a lecture summary and a comprehension check. This is just going through major kind of high points of the lecture, so make sure that you're going through and reading this. The comprehension check, this is going to be an opportunity for you to go through and check and make sure that you understand material from the lecture. If you can go down through and answer these questions off the top of your head without looking back through your notes, you should be good to go in terms of having a good handle on stuff. So, thank you so much for bearing with me. Again, this starting on a Wednesday is kind of thrown off our schedule a little bit, but I promise we'll make it up on the back end. We'll have some dead days, and many of you will finish up early with stuff. So thanks again. Great meeting you all this afternoon, and we'll catch you all on Friday.